are going to kind of give small pieces of information, just few slides, the last few slides, discussing about the awareness, auditory awareness and imagery. And that is another really interesting thing that we need to discuss about. First of all, just let's compare what we have in the auditory system with the visual system. In the visual system, we can just close our eyes. We can just close it without having trying to block the information that is going inside. Can we close our ears? The other thing that it seems that when we go to sleep, probably the last thing that is being stopped in terms of the auditory, the sensory processing would be the hearing pathways. And the first thing that would start to be back when we want to wake up is the hearing. That's the reason that we usually just say people by name when we want to wake them up and ask them to go out of the bed. And that is an interesting part about the auditory processing. But there are still some other aspects to that. One of the interesting thing is people have done studies in terms of putting people inside the scanner when they are asleep, and they give them visual auditory stimuli when they are asleep inside the scanner. And they realize that the auditory processing and the activation on the primary auditory cortex is still happening, even when we are completely slept. So it's amazing that the auditory system is still working while we are slept. And that might be the reason that there are people who try to, let's say, help people to learn new language when they're asleep, and it's not really being supported by scientific evidence. But we know that the auditory system is still working even when we are asleep. And even some of the secondary auditory processing are happening. Even when we call people by name, when they are totally slept, we have activations in amygdala. So that is amazing that how this part of the system is still active even when we are closing our eyes. And that might be the reason that, there are definitely some evolutionary reasons for that. That when we are asleep on the jungle, even the small pieces of sounds around us might be really important for us to be able to survive in the environment, to be able to wake up and just run away from an imminent threat around us. So it is going to be critically important to know how the level of consciousness that we have for auditory process is going to be different compared to the visual process, and how we can bring the pieces of information from the auditory system to the consciousness. And what we discuss about in terms of that attentional window could be displaced in different parts of the surrounding environment by top-down or descending pathways that go to even to the cochlea, that are even fine-tuning some of the hair cells, the auditory sensory cells in the ears, to be able to perceive some of the information that are more important for us, that we are interested to have more details about, to fine-tune the ears. It's exactly the the term that sometimes we use, that I'm just fine-tuning my ear to be able to understand what is happening or what people are talking about just behind me, and being able to understand that. So we can even fine-tune those sensory sensors, auditory sensors in our ears, to be able to receive the information in a way that we are looking for. Okay? And then it's also amazing that even when we start to imagine sounds, we can activate different areas that are related to sound processing. So we can have activations in areas. And even when we start to imagine music, we can activate areas in the the limbic system in the amygdala when we just replay a music in our mind, and we can activate those areas again. As an example, something like the last slide that we have today, when we perceive a sound, we have activations in the primary auditory cortex. Now that probably know that this one is the primary auditory cortex. But these pieces are secondary. So we know that these pieces are secondary. So as you can see here, this is the Heschel gyrus, and then these pieces are secondary in the kind of the parietal or the kind of the temporal areas in the area something like 22. When we just make an imagery sound for us, there is not very much activation in the primary auditory cortex. We have that in the secondary auditory cortex, because here the sound is not just a sound. Sound is a concept and has its own multi-modality representation, which has both auditory component, visual component, and other conceptual kind of elements to that mental representation that we are making with auditory imagery. Okay, that was the last piece of the complex story that we told today in terms of the auditory processing in the brain. I hope that you had now, at least at the end of the class, you have a sense that, okay, it seems that there are some complexities in the auditory system that we still need to learn and think about, and that is going to be something that I highly recommend you to consider. And it's quite amazing that there are people who say that, okay, I mean, auditory system is not something that is my research focus. I'm working on, let's say, another area, let's say drug addiction. Why auditory cortex is important for me, who is doing research in let's say, decision making. I'm mainly focused on frontal cortex. But in reality, without having a good understanding about how different pieces of this system is working, and then being able to put them together in terms of the networks and how they're interacting together, you would never be able to have a clear understanding about how the brain is working. And I made few examples in terms of even things that are related to drug addiction could be really important in areas related to auditory processing and how these things are going to be related to each other.